afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our anti-human trafficking presentation for the PD Day on October 22nd. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the members on screen as the members of our anti-human trafficking subcommittee here at the board. As part of what we would normally do as we begin, we're going to warn you that the content here can be difficult. This presentation contains material about sex trafficking that may be difficult for some individuals to reflect upon or to discuss. It may cause strong emotional and/or psychological responses. The SMCDSB staff who may need additional support can access resources through the EAP or Employee Connect or your benefits. If needed, please contact the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010 for any assistance. For our presentation today, this is just a brief outline of the topics and areas we're hoping to cover. What is human trafficking? Why is this an important topic in our schools? And what we can do to prevent human trafficking and support victims and survivors in our school. Most importantly, let's review our learning outcomes for today. Through this introductory presentation, staff will gain increased understanding of human trafficking as it relates to our region and more specifically our schools. With this information, staff will be better equipped to enhance protective factors for students, notice concerns, and respond by reaching out and/or supporting a referral. Before we get too deep into our presentation, let's take a second to watch this 4-minute video that outlines what is human trafficking.
I'm Amy. I did really well in school. I had a lot of friends, but I really hated the way I looked. I started dating Ryan. He just seemed really interested in me. He gave me a lot of attention. He loved me. He just made me feel really good about myself. We talked a lot about what we wanted and the future. I was in love with him. After 2 months, he started telling me he had money problems. He told me his friend's girlfriend was opening a massage parlor and I should go and work there.
Sex trafficking is when someone is forced to sell sex against their will. This is happening right under our noses. It could be happening to a girl just like a girl you know. They are lured in public places, schools, malls, and online.
All our victims to date have come from Toronto or somewhere else in Canada.
The girls that I work with are 16 to 24. I do get calls about girls as young as 12 and 13 years old. They can be an ace student at school, but still not have self-confidence. So that is a common thread with all the girls that I work with.
He told me it would only be for a little while. You know, we would make all this money and buy a house. I was working 12 hours a day. I was in so much pain from having sex.
The way that they lure the girls is to romance them, compliment them that they're pretty, to buy them nice things, to shower them with attention.
Girls, they fall in love with these guys. These guys become their boyfriends at first.
I had this total breakdown and I was crying and I told him, I don't know if I could do this, letting these guys be all over me. He was like, you better figure out how to deal with it because I'm not going to be with a girl who isn't giving me money.
Typically, one girl could make a pimp about $250,000 a year. And that's just one girl. It's very lucrative. It's as lucrative or even more lucrative than selling firearms or drugs.
And I'm hearing conversations like, if we killed her, like we can just bury her somewhere up north and no one will ever find her. I was just so scared. And the thought going through my head is that he really could have killed me.
The trafficker imposes lots of rules on the girls. So they're not allowed to eat or sleep without his permission. They're not allowed to go out on their own. Even if they are, he is watching their every move, and they know not to go against what he's telling them they have to do.
I felt so much shame and guilt. And I still didn't understand that I'd been pimped out.
Some of the red flags to look for when you suspect someone might be sex trafficked. The girl has nice, expensive clothing. She's going out and she's not telling you where she's going. Her grades at school might start to slip, and her world becomes more and more secretive. She talks about having a boyfriend in her life, but she's not going to introduce that guy to the family. My hope for these girls is they reclaim their lives and go after their dreams and have a good life.
Okay, so as we move through this presentation, that video, although hard to watch, provides a lot of information that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about. So as we go here to the next slide. All right, so some key definitions that are going to be important to consider. So human trafficking, it involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and or exercising control over a person in order to exploit that person. Sex trafficking is one form of human trafficking. Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes worldwide, and Ontario is a hub. We're going to talk about that more in this presentation. There's no universal experience of human trafficking, and it is known to result in severe trauma for survivors. And they might have a non-linear healing journey as they work to rebuild their lives. We're going to be talking about victims and survivors. So that definition of victim is going to refer to an individual who's in the process of being recruited or trafficked, and survivor will be used to refer to an individual who has exited that trafficking situation. And then a little bit more as we talk about human sex trafficking, which will be the focus of the presentation today. And so that is going to refer to the sexual abuse of children, youth, or even adults through the exchange of sex and or sexual acts for drugs, food, shelter, protection, other basic life needs, and or money. So when we think about the act, that's sort of the what. So talking about what is happening to these people, to these women, men. We talk about recruitment, transfer, transportation, harboring, receipt of persons, the means or the how. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that is through the use of threat or force, coercion, certainly deception and fraud, the abuse of power, and the abuse of somebody's vulnerability. And then the purpose or the why. It is sexual exploitation, and that includes a lot of different things. And so that's child pornography, sexual abuse images, forced prostitution, could be relationship-based, could also be sextortion, so that's blackmailing, gang-involved exploitation, webcam hacking, survival-based exploitation, and then traditional indoor venues such as strip clubs and massage parlors. Now we're going to talk briefly about some common myths and misconceptions. So one myth that we have is human trafficking victims are kidnapped or restrained and taken by a stranger and brought to another country.
So in reality, 93% of human trafficking cases in Canada involve cases with Canadian victims. The perpetrators are often someone the victim already knows. And rather than physical force, victims are often groomed over a period of time using psychological or emotional manipulation.
Our next myth. If a person isn't kept locked up or in chains, then they can always just leave.
And unfortunately, in reality, traffickers use a range of tactics to coerce, control, and exploit their victims, So for example, traffickers may build and then manipulate an intimate relationship. They might use psychological forms of control, financial dependence. So for example, if a victim has poor credit, a trafficker may leverage this over the victim or create a scenario where the victim becomes in debt from the trafficker taking out loans or credit cards in their name. There can be threats of personal safety toward the victim or the safety of their family members. There may be fears of criminalization, reluctance to report to the police, language barriers, having nowhere to go, just feeling trapped.
Our next myth. Some people choose to be involved in exploitive situations.
In reality, in this, there is no choice. No one can consent to being trafficked. No one under the age of 18 can consent to involvement in the commercial sex trade. Traffickers' manipulation and control tactics might lead victims to feel like they're choosing to be in the sex trade, but unfortunately, this leads to further harm against the victims, and it can make the victims feel like they're responsible for what's happened to them. So I'm going to be speaking about how human trafficking impacts us in our region. This chart from Statistics Canada shows the incidence of reported cases of human trafficking across Canada. Ontario, despite having 39% of Canada's population, has approximately 2/3 of its human trafficking cases. Our region is considered a source, transit, and destination for human trafficking. Human trafficking incidents are most often reported in urban centers, but traffickers often will target their victims from northern or remote communities. So these maps show the source, transit, and destination data for human trafficking in Ontario. The map on the left shows the trafficking corridor that runs from Montreal to Windsor. We also have trafficking corridors running north, so through central and northern Ontario. So for example, from Toronto north to Barrie through Sudbury and Thunder Bay, that connects over to Winnipeg. Human trafficking, it's very much an issue that directly impacts us in our region and in our communities.
And in response to our region's involvement in human trafficking and in response to the Ontario Strategic Plan to support anti-human trafficking initiatives in Ontario, our principal groups from all areas, so Catholic principals groups, public principals groups, and French groups are joining together with Toronto's Victim Services support and OPP groups across the country, across the province, in the formulation of resources to better support. And our school board was specifically chosen to be represented on that committee because of the high percentage of rates associated to human trafficking in our area.
Human trafficking impact our schools? First of all, let's take a look at where traffickers find their victims. It's a sad reality, but it turns out that in schools, traffickers can pose as older friends or boyfriends to young victims who develop a false sense of trust in them. This can happen in youth shelters, local youth hangouts, or through drug connections as well. Going online, by reviewing social media profiles and posts, a trafficker can determine the likes, dislikes, feelings, and needs of potential victims. Using online apps or gaming, students have no real way to ensure who they are talking to. The loss of face-to-face conversations, combined with our youth's obsession on likes, puts them at risk of falling victim to fake profiles. In addition, hiding behind a screen, students may feel more empowered and confident, which could lead them to engage in risky sharing online. So who are the traffickers? Traffickers can be strangers, acquaintances, friends, or family. Looking at the Canadian statistics of persons accused of an incident of human trafficking between 2009 and 2016, we can see that the majority of traffickers are young adults between the ages of 18 and 24. Worth noting is that 5% of traffickers are school-aged youth, which means that we need to keep our eyes and ears open not only for signs of victims in our schools, but also for signs of traffickers. Traffickers of all ages are masters of deception who can spot and exploit almost any vulnerability or emotional need, often paying sudden attention to potential victims doing their best to temporarily meet the needs of their victims as they lure them, pretending to become friends or boyfriends.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly is grooming. So grooming is defined as techniques used to target, recruit, lure, and groom victims, and are often rely on deception and coercion. Traffickers learn what an individual wants or needs, money, affection, attention, material goods, a place to live, drugs, and builds trust and reliance by fulfilling these needs. And then they use this dependence to manipulate the individual. And so if you think about what, as we talk about social media and we talk about what happens online, sometimes those wants or needs or vulnerabilities are shared through the images and the things that are being posted. And so those vulnerabilities or needs can be really easy for a trafficker to identify. Traffickers may spend weeks, months, or even years grooming a victim before the exploitation even begins. So that relationship focus at the beginning, the identification of the trafficker as the boyfriend can really be a lot of time before that exploitation begins. Building that trusting relationship with a youth with a level of emotional and physical dependency is key in the grooming and recruitment process. All right, and so again, this is just another review, some of the ways that traffickers control their victims, and that includes that psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, lies, addiction, threats, violence, isolation, and taking control of key documents. And they may also force their victims to recruit other victims, including friends and peers, classmates. And oftentimes some of the threats that when we're talking about the cases, case examples, even include like the threat to kind of tell parents or tell families about either images that have been collected or about a party that they've been to or a relationship that they're in. And so it certainly spans a lot of different scenarios.
So who is at risk for sex trafficking? Anyone from any walk of life can be a target for human trafficking. However, individuals from certain populations may be at a greater risk. So for example, females, people that identify as 2S LGBTQ+, children in care, Indigenous women and girls, homeless, marginalized youth, those with a history of abuse, new immigrants, persons with disabilities, those struggling socially, financially, people who have low self-esteem or isolated or lack a sense of belonging. Perpetrators of human trafficking identify a person's vulnerabilities, and then they target those vulnerabilities to gain trust and form a bond. In that grooming process, those vulnerabilities can then be used to manipulate the victims. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Anyone can be at risk of being trafficked. In Canada, 95% of victims of police-reported human trafficking were women and girls. According to Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy, the average age for recruitment into sex trafficking is 13 years old. Over 70% of human trafficking victims identified by police are under 25. And 92% of victims and survivors of human trafficking in Canada are trafficked by someone they know. As Nicole described, many victims are recruited in places like their schools, local hangouts, or online. Human trafficking, it is a problem in our region, it's a problem in our schools, it's a secondary problem, and it's an elementary problem.
So what is our role as Simcoe Muskoka Catholic District School Board staff when it comes to anti-human trafficking strategies? We can all play an integral role in combating sex trafficking of school-aged children and youth when equipped with the appropriate tools and necessary skills. We already promote that all students have a right to a safe and nurturing learning environment and a climate that is safe, positive, and free from exploitation at school and in the broader school community, and this is really important. However, we are being asked to take this commitment to the next level because schools can play a unique role to help combat child sexual exploitation and in particular, sex trafficking. First of all, schools can serve as an important partner in identifying, responding to, and preventing sex trafficking including connecting students to supportive services. So how do we do this? Teachers and other education staff are well placed to educate on prevention and to promote healthy relationships, which is so fundamentally important. We can also notice troubling changes in behavior and connect with students as caring adults. Caring adults and students within schools can promote a sense of student belonging, increase protective factors, help to reduce risk factors associated with sex trafficking, and support early intervention through identification and appropriate response, including connecting impacted persons to supportive services. Supporting prevention and enhancing protective factors. This is an important area where we as educators can really have an impact. Welcoming and engaging school environments lead to positive student experiences, especially when families and communities are intentionally involved in the students' learning. Safe schools, both physically and psychologically, are a critical element to successfully nurturing positive student experiences. Schools are well placed to respond to sex trafficking and are a key factor in helping survivors of trafficking heal and rebuild their lives. Schools promote safety by building a culture of caring and by taking meaningful, culturally responsive, and consistent action to prevent and respond to issues of safety and inappropriate behaviors. Caring adults within the school serve as critical resources in maintaining open lines of communication with students and in preventing, identifying, and responding early to suspected sex trafficking. Just as an aside here, and as an example of the importance of your role as a caring adult, I used to have a young student who would come and have lunch with me a few times a week. And it was during one of these lunches that she disclosed to me that her sister was being exploited by her online boyfriend. The police were quickly involved in this situation. When this student started asking if she could eat lunch with me regularly, I had no idea that she had something so important to tell me, but I could tell that she was in need of a little extra TLC. It turns out that your role as a caring adult is particularly important, as most children who are being sex trafficked are in school at the time, and survivors have reported that teachers or educators could have played an important role in supporting their exit. Retention efforts are also an important factor in the prevention of sex trafficking. Research suggests that graduating high school is a protective factor against sex trafficking. In fact, not completing high school is both a risk factor and a consequence of sex trafficking. As part of prevention efforts, educators as caring adults can help students to build skills to reduce the risk factors by teaching students about healthy relationships, gender-based violence, and social emotional skills through skill-based anti-sex trafficking curricula or awareness-raising initiatives. Teaching the 2019 grades 1 to 8 health and phys ed curriculum helps students learn skills to identify, develop, and maintain healthy relationships, as well as how to identify and respond to exploitative and coercive behavior, and how to seek help as needed. These skills help to protect students against human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Please consider a student's stage of development and ability to understand content when having conversations about human trafficking. Be sure to consider both the age of the child and their development or cognitive abilities when having these conversations and adjust accordingly. Here below, you'll see a resource that provides conversation suggestions for younger children, older children, and adolescents. You will have access to view this a little bit later on.
Unmute. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about supporting and responding. So some signs to look out for. So I'm just going to move everybody so you can see us all here. So the possible signs that someone is being groomed for sex trafficking, some of them were identified in the video, and we've talked about some, but examples might be withdrawing from family and friends, being secretive about activities, having a new boyfriend or girlfriend or a friend they don't really want to introduce to anybody, suddenly spending a lot of time with older people, frequently missing or attendance challenges at school, absences or decline in a school performance, wearing more sexualized clothing, or certainly posting more sexualized photos on social media, having new clothing, jewelry, shoes, anything that maybe you would think they can't afford to buy, suddenly having a new cell phone or a second cell phone or a new number, and showing signs of physical abuse. This list is not exhaustive. It's just some possible indicators. And it's also possible indicators for other mental health concerns and reasons to kind of reach out and check in. And it's important to remember that a child or young person who has been trafficked might not self-identify as a victim. They might have loyalty to their trafficker. They might look older than their age and feel that they are in love with their trafficker and have a good relationship with them. They might downplay the severity of the exploitation and abuse. And again, there are reasons why victims may not want to tell somebody. And that could be the shame and guilt that comes with being a victim of human trafficking, and the worry about how they might be perceived or judged, feeling embarrassed about it. Also the fear that they're not going to be believed, it's not going to be taken seriously. They might also be worried about their safety with respect to the trafficker, and also might feel like it's their fault. So it can be very difficult for a survivor to leave a trafficking situation. And it's important to know that it often takes several attempts for them to be able to exit the trafficking situation, and also several attempts before they're able to seek assistance and support. So it is very important to recognize it's a long process that does not, follow this straight line.
Thank you, Chantal. So for victims of sex trafficking, disclosures or sharing personal information about being exploited can be a very emotional and vulnerable experience. A supportive, caring adult can have a very powerful impact on students involved in trafficking, and that's something that can be our role within the school system. Specifically, that role that we can play is noticing and responding. So on this slide here, we have a few different resources. So one of them is the One Call Desk reference. And so this is available in physical copies at schools, as well as online on our board's mental health website. In this, what's covered are the importance of those caring relationships that we have with our students. And, Nicole shared her own example of her experience in that situation. Noticing when something's not right. It walks through more specifics about our role of noticing, listening, connecting them to appropriate services. And it has a section on how to have conversations with students on these difficult topics. Acknowledging what Chantal said, where we need to kind of meet students at their stage of readiness. And then if we jump back to the slide deck, we also have our psychology department staff. So we have school counselors, we have our First Nations, Métis and Inuit counselors, we have our psychologists and psychological associates, and just knowing who the staff are that are supporting your schools directly, so that you're knowing when to reach out when something's sort of outside of your scope as a teacher. And as well, we have the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. So in having these difficult conversations with our students, we must remember the laws and regulations that require our duty to report. If there are concerns that a student may be in need of protection, including concerns of sexual abuse or sexual exploitation, school staff have a duty to report. This duty is based on reasonable suspicion. It's not a role to investigate or confirm before reporting. For some, it can feel like a very intimidating thing to do, but we need to put our students' safety and well-being first, and it's a legal requirement. If a student discloses something to us, we can never promise confidentiality in situations that could compromise their safety. We can always do our best to respect their privacy and their dignity, though.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about human trafficking, human sex trafficking, and some really hard kind of realities and information to take in provincially, but specifically locally, and recognizing that it's happening in our school board. We know that from personal experiences and stories we've heard within our school board, as well as what the statistics tell us. And that can feel very overwhelming and can feel really hard to know what to do about such a big and challenging issue, to kind of know what's my role within the school system and what can I do in response to this. And so I think that's really important as educators and as school staff, that we recognize there's so many fundamental things that you're doing already that create the space for a student to tell you that they're in crisis, or that they need help, or that they're thinking something might not be right about what's going on for them. And those are, again, are things you're already doing, but this is an important piece just to kind of keep an ear out or a consideration as you support students and create that safe space for them. And so I think that's really important as we kind of carry that hope and understand our role in this, that you have the skills. It's just about kind of recognizing that this is something we need to help prevent by educating students around kind of those different safety measures, healthy relationships. So we're going to talk about that a little bit further, but also creating those safe spaces. And so building rapport and trust, being non-judgmental when they're disclosing something, believing them, reminding the victims that it's not their fault. Do no harm. So if it does not, if whatever they're disclosing to you feels outside of your wheelhouse, recognizing that you have support in knowing kind of in figuring out what to do next or how to help them. And so that's why it's really important for every educator to know who the psychology staff are that are supporting your school. Asking your principal is a great starting place. If you're not sure, every school has staff assigned, and we are there to support with any questions you might have and support with those resources and become involved if that makes sense as well. So that's just kind of reiterates referring, seeking support, and certainly following up, empowering and encouraging, providing choices and options, slowing down communication, because again, we know relationships take time. Creating a safe space takes time. It doesn't happen in one moment or one session, as Nicole's example was. Spending time eating lunch with a student can create that space for that student to feel confident that they'll be believed and that what they'll be sharing will be taken seriously and without judgment. So all very important pieces. And so additional information and resources. And so there are a couple different resources linked here, and they're also linked within the PDF of this presentation, as well as linked to the time for discussion and planning following this presentation. And so there are specific resources and lesson plans available from White Ribbon, which is a partnership with the Ontario government around, again, lesson plans around sexual exploitation. And again, because we're also keeping in mind that preventative piece and considering stage of development, this resource here, and I'm just going to click on it to take us to it as we go, because we have that time to check in. It kind of goes through the different age ranges. So again, younger children, 2 to 6, what are we going to do to help prevent and build those resiliency factors for this age group? Well, we're going to talk about respect and care for our bodies, our right to personal space, fairness and equity, right? There are lots of things that we can do at a very young age. For older children, again, those upper elementary years, what does it mean to work? What does work relationships look like? How do you make money? All of those things are important pieces of information that lead to protective factors and resiliency factors in this bigger conversation. And then certainly when you get into that adolescent age group, that's when the conversations about sexual education and exploitation can really kind of go a little bit more intentional, as well as bringing in these conversations about media literacy and online safety are important throughout. We know young children are accessing online gaming, they're accessing social media, that there are many online opportunities for risk. And so having those conversations at an appropriate stage of development is really important. And it's also really important that there's that pathway to support. How would they know if something inappropriate is happening, and what would that conversation look like to tell an adult? And for a lot of students, they might be worried about losing the game or losing their access to social media. And so that's where it's really important, you know, as parents and educators, that we're kind of talking about and working together on how to have these conversations. The trap, that is hyperlinked in here as well. And there's a little icon of the phone. This is a really great exercise to go through that teaches you, or kind of takes you through a simulation of how that hook happens from a trafficker. You have this online kind of simulated experience around what those text conversations look like, and you get to pick these different pathways and how the grooming process happens. And so that's a really great resource to check out to really get a better sense of that process. Again, that one call desk reference, and then earlier in the slide deck, there was a little insert that you can put in with that, just kind of staple it to that resource where you're identifying your psychology staff, where you're adding that human trafficking hotline number, so that all of that is available to you at the tip of your fingers. And it's also important to know that when kids are facing a crisis, they need a soft place to land to make sure that they can go somewhere for help. And so our biggest role within our education system is to build those resilient skills and to do that teaching, but also to supporting creating that soft space for students to land when they're reaching out, because we know that often happens with teachers, with guidance staff, with educators, with principals. And so it's our job to continue to do that good work. Okay, and so we know that in a brief presentation on such an important topic, it is hard to cover everything in a way, well, certainly doing it virtually, covering the sensitive topic. That's why we chose to do it in this presentation style where you can see our faces and connect with us. But we know that there's probably a lot more questions and concerns or topics around human trafficking that you might want to know more about. And so as a committee, what we've committed to is to send out this Google form. So it's hyperlinked in, you can click on it. If you have a question or there's a theme or a topic you want to know more about or have resources around, please submit that form to us. We are going to review all of those questions and themes and then create an FAQ document where we're answering your questions with the resources and links and information that we have available to us so that we can be really responsive to the questions that our system has. And with that, I'm just going to stop sharing and bring everybody back together for us to just sort of end our presentation here. So thank you for taking the time to listen and to hear some difficult information. We hope, again, back to those learning goals, that this information has provided some context about why we're talking about it and why specifically it's relevant to Simcoe Muskoka Catholic and our area within Ontario, but also leaving you with a sense of kind of hope and direction around what you can do within your role at the school board to both build those protective factors and intervene with that supportive place and supportive conversations when those conversations come to you. And so we hope we've kind of fulfilled those learning goals. But if you have any questions, please complete the Google form. Anybody else want to jump in and kind of say some wrap ups?
I guess I just wanted to reiterate how important each and every one of you are. Every single child needs someone they can connect with, and they have to know that somebody really genuinely cares. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and take care. Don't forget about those extra resources from the beginning of the slide if you need to reach out for support. Bye now. Oh, I'm going to edit. Sorry, I'm going to stop recording. I just need to figure out how to do that.